Okay, so today we're going to be getting into the code, which is usually my favorite part of doing things, but sometimes my most cursed part, because as many of you know, writing code is not always easy. Before I start, Dave, I'd like you to talk a little bit about David Kent Consulting, and then I'll go ahead and continue.
We're pleased to be a part of Cohesion Virtual Summit 2021. David Kent Consulting is a team of real world practitioners, all seasoned professionals and our goal is to help you get more from your investment in Oracle and Banner. We are a team of innovators, and we always, our passion is to always challenge ourselves, our clients, and the status quo to constant and continual innovation are what we're about. Okay?
Thank you so much. Why would I want to write code using Python with any cloud provider? OCI has the OCI CLI, Azure has the Azure CLI, has Azure PowerShell applets that are written in .NET. AWS has their CLI as well. And then there's Terraform modules, there are Ansible modules, there are Chef and Puppet modules. Why would I want to write in Python? Why would I want to learn the SDKs? One reason might be that I would want to directly integrate with a front-end application that I may be building or my team may be building. A case in point, the folks at NetApp, they've got an internal IT department of about 150 people, and they wanted to have a cloud app that could build a development environment on demand. So they chose to write an application where you would put in your request along with your charge codes and what you were asking for, and if it was in an available package of pre-built development environments, it would then just, when you would click on the go button, it would queue it up. And so basically what they were doing was Python scraping from that web application and then calling the Python code to actually build that cloud environment. Another reason to write in Python is simply this. It's so much easier to debug something that you're trying to do if you want to have precise control over things. And if it's really complex and you're having a really hard time getting it to work with a declarative language that is returning a meaningless error that points you nowhere in the direction what the root cause is, and you've engaged hours and hours on searching blogs only to get more and more inaccurate or out of date or incomplete and half-baked information. Sometimes it makes sense just to go directly to the same APIs that these wrappers are written on. Go right to the source and write a tool that solves the problem that you're working on. The declarative languages, and I'm alluding to this, but now I'm going to be very literal about it. The declarative language environments like Terraform and Ansible don't always provide for meaningful error output. For instance, I was writing something 2 nights ago for standing up an Azure AKS cluster, and the Terraform error said invalid format in profile, and then the profile name, which pointed back to a method, and I couldn't find any source code on GitHub with Azure regarding that method. So I had no idea what was wrong, and I was very frustrated about it. And finally, I just got down and got the Python SDKs, and I wrote my own code, and boom, went in and wrote code that would create the cluster in the particular way that I wanted it to be created. Later, I imagine I will find out a solution to that problem, but I got the work done. And that might be a reason to write directly to Python for your cloud provider. Now, a word about the OCI command line interface tools or the CLI tools. They're slow. They're not buggy anymore, but they were really buggy even 2 years ago. But every now and then they do come out with a bad release with some defects in them where they break something that had been working before. They're inefficient to work with, as you've got to deal with these OCID or these Oracle Cloud identifiers. And unfortunately, the authors of the CLI tool, with the exception of a couple of modules, have not made it easy to deal with OCIDs in a human readable way. The other cloud providers definitely have. Azure, AWS, GCP, you can work with aliases, which is basically the human readable name for what the underlying ID is. And in particular with Azure, if you can build your own identifier if you know the name of the subscription, the Azure module, the resource group, and you could plug all that in and build your own if you want to. But with OCI, it's just not fun to do that, to deal with those OCIDs and to write large stanzas of code in a declarative language to extract what you're looking for and define the descriptive name of something. Also, some of the declarative language tools, mainly not Terraform, but mainly Ansible, Puppet, and Chef, don't help you when it comes to creating duplicate resources. You've got to go through a process and discover your entire compartment hierarchy to the child compartment where the resources are. Then you have to discover all the resources that you have for a particular resource type. And then you've got to write code, and it's kind of weird to do things like a while loop in a declarative language. So you've got to kind of loop through the objects, the data objects, the dictionary objects when you get them to find the descriptive name. And then you've got to deal with something called a lifecycle state. Is it failed? Is it terminated? Is it terminating? Is it creating or initial or launching? Is it in an available state? Is it in a number of error states? And so the way that Oracle has written their modules for that is just difficult with these other languages. You still have to deal with OCIDs in Terraform, but Terraform is a better declarative language environment to work in to do that, but it's still a pain in the neck to do. So we're going to go to the Cloud School of Hard Knocks, where your name goes here for having demonstrated extraordinarily resilience in the face of adversity for crap no one should have to deal with. Anyone who's written a lot of code could appreciate that. So here is an example of a Terraform stanza for a manifest. And you see they're so kind as to say var.compartment ID. They're suggesting you've got to use vars. But what is actually there? What is that? That is this thing right here. You can tell that it's a compartment. You know that it's in the identity module if you know the modules. You can tell based on this, if you know what the descriptors are, that that's US Ashburn East. And you can then see the actual identifier here. And you got all this other stuff that you've got to deal with when you get that dictionary object. And so you've got to write the code to sort through that. And it's a pain in the neck to deal with. So you can see here, I ran an Ansible script 3 times, and 3 times in a row, it created this weekly backup policy object in the cohesion compartment that I had created as a demonstration. But very early on, when I first started writing code in Oracle Cloud and having worked with other clouds before that have, shall we say, better written modules, I didn't encounter this kind of a problem. And then At one point, Oracle came out with a whole new revision of the Ansible modules as I had solved the problem, and they changed the syntax in a very material way, which basically meant that that code base that I wrote was stuck at that version, and I had to do an entire rewrite to get my code running, and I was not happy. And that's when I made the determining factor to just say, the heck with it, I'm going straight to Python. I'm not dealing with this again. Here's another winner where one person is provisioning a resource and another person on the team is terminating the same resource that you just provisioned. Oh boy, not a pretty picture. Sure, with Terraform, assuming that you're properly managing that Terraform state file that is so important to maintaining the integrity of your cloud infrastructure. You're not going to go off the rails with something like that. But with other declarative languages, it's very easy to end up in this box. And of course, with Terraform, if you mishandle that Terraform state file, if you don't back it up, or if you have rogue developers with their own Terraform state file, you're going to be in trouble really, really fast. Now here's a nice ouch. So this machine here has just terminated. Here's a new instance. Geez, which boot volume belongs to that? And why did the module not delete the volume? And then here's a real winner from the school of hard knocks. I just want a list of the valid backups in a readable format that makes sense. What the heck is this? I don't see a machine name here. I don't see easily readable dates. All the dates are in UTC time. I want to see the times in my time zone, et cetera, and so forth. The output of these tools always going in JSON and not giving you in some kind of tabulated format is very frustrating. And then, of course, there's the documentation. Now, I will say the documentation on the Python and the Java SDKs from OCI are great, and you'll see that shortly. But the documentation on the Terraform modules, that's okay, but I wouldn't rate it as great. The Ansible, Puppet, and Chef, and in many cases, you will have a document like in this example where the documented example doesn't match the latest rev of the code. So you're trying to take advantage of a new feature and it's not even documented. Now you got to fish around and drop down into the collections directly into the code and read the code, which means you're reading the classes, the methods, the decorators, and you're trying to put this all together so you can understand what needs to be in that manifest to build that resource. Very time consuming when the documentation is not right. And then, well, Microsoft and AWS and GCP, they're not perfect either. And I actually took a screenshot. It angered me so much that I was trying to do something, and what I got was a big fat bug. And so I was like, I'm not going to spend my whole night waiting on support to get back with me. I need to get this resource deployed because the client's expecting it tomorrow morning. So I just wrote the Python code to bang it out, and then I opened up a support ticket with Microsoft Development. There are pre-install requirements. And mind you, what you learned today with Oracle Cloud Programming, a lot of it is applicable to other cloud providers. But I will tell you that other cloud providers, the big three, are not doing as good of a job of documenting their software development kits as Oracle. Oracle has done a really super job on that, and you'll see why in a little while. So you need to be Python 3.8 or later, and you got to be at pip 3 upgraded. You should have Jupyter Notebook and Jupyter-Lab installed, especially if you're looking at a lot of code. You should be setting up a Python virtual environment for your own development machine. Why would you want to do that? Because things break all the time. I don't know about you, but I hate re-imaging my machine. That just, 2 hours, 3 hours lost for that. No, thank you. If I'm doing something new and I'm downloading a new update, I'm going to do it in my virtual environment. And if it breaks, just delete the VE and roll back to the previous VE, and I'm still cooking with my code. I recommend PowerShell. Now, if you're on Windows, you're already there. If you're on Linux or Mac, then you should be running PowerShell version 3 or later. And I strongly recommend Visual Studio Code with extensions, but PyCharm is a good alternative. And you want to set up Docker Desktop and test your code in a container with a bind mount that loads your local Git repo. And that's easy to do. And I'll show you at the latter portion of today's workshop how to do that. As of this week, these are the versions that you should be at. Now, if you get into a situation where you're not maintaining your versions and you get into a version misalignment, things are going to break very quickly. That's where it's key to have the Python VE, because you can have multiple Python virtual environments on your development desktop. And also, it's a good practice when you have a release that you're getting ready to push into the deployment pipeline, that you save that in a container image and push it up to a container registry. This way, if you need to go back to that version for any reason, you can do that. Tools, let's talk about that. So you've got the Git client. 2.x has been out for a while. It is far superior to 1.x. Docker Desktop, Python, I'm at 3.9x. The CLI tools, you're always going to pull the latest CLI tools when you do a fresh deployment. You're always going to pull the latest Python SDK unless there's a known big bad defect, in which case you'll downgrade it. You want the Jupyter tools, the Jupyter-Lab add-on. You want PowerShell. That is a typo. That should say 7.3, not 7.1. And the latest version of Visual Studio Code or PyCharm. Now here's some useful documentation. There's a lot of junk out there. One day I did a DuckDuckGo search on an SDK, and I ended up on a web scraping site that was just hitting me with just a tiny little bit of advertising. I was trying to focus out of my mind. And I'm working with the documentation on the code. And I don't see the feature and the version of the OCI SDK that I'm running on. And long story short, I opened up an SR and Oracle said, that's not our site. Here's our site. It's like, oh, great, I got fooled. So make sure when you look at official Oracle documentation that you're on the official Oracle site. Don't make that mistake. Now, there is the OCI application and infrastructure community. Sometimes useful, usually not. And then you've got the Git repo where the actual code is. You can look at the classes, the methods, the decorators. You can see all that. And that's sometimes useful when you're on the leading edge of the code and you're testing it and you want to make sure that it's working with code you've got running in the field and you discover a big fat bug. So it's helpful to be able to go to the code and say, well, is it a problem in that module or is it a problem in the REST API service? And sometimes cloud providers will make a change in the REST API service and they will forget to follow up or they'll have a breakdown in their practices and they'll forget to update the documentation to reflect that. Or they might have a defect in the REST service, or they might actually have a failure going on. And I've had all of these situations happen to me. Of course, Oracle support, and I would tell you the cloud support with Oracle, that is really one of the valuable things you get in Oracle Cloud. They provide much better support than the big three cloud providers, and they don't charge you an arm and a leg to get that support. So that's a cool thing. Setting up the OCI API key. The document is messy. We're going to go through it a little bit, and I'll show you what it means to do that. And I'm going to take you away from the wrappers and show you the actual configuration file itself, so that, as a developer, you'll know what to do with that right away. Of course, there's the Python documentation, the GitHub guide, Docker users guide, the official documentation site, and then as per this morning's class, I have the same doc link here for this neat set of Git commands here from this independent site. So what are we building today? We're going to build code that's going to create a compartment. We're going to have code that creates a security list and a route table, and a virtual cloud network, and a subnet. We're going to have code that is going to list all the supplied images, and we're going to launch a VM. Sounds like it's not much, but actually when you see the code, there's quite a bit there. This is the enterprise architecture for what we're building. I think almost all of you who are on this call were on this morning's call, so I'm not going to get up on the soapbox again about enterprise architecture. You know how I feel about it, and you know what can happen to your cloud spend if you don't have an EA, or if your EA doesn't really match what your needs are. So before we begin the build, are there any questions? We're going to be getting in pretty deep here. Okay, let's go to it.